Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do.
If a kid has pain, right? Like if it's like, oh, I just had pain for like 5 seconds, we don't need to freak out. But if it is becoming every day at practice for a week or 2 weeks, they're complaining of pain, kind of nipping that in the bud is going to make for a faster recovery down the road. So if you ignore Severs for 6 months, then it is going to take a long time, and they may to go in a boot for a little bit. So really paying attention and making sure kids are being honest and not just writing it off, I think is important, so that the recovery is faster. Same thing with gymnast wrists. I've had kids, they come in and their x-rays look pretty good, but it seems like gymnast wrists, they're back in a month. But then I've had kids ignore it, and then I'm casting them for 6 weeks and then a brace for another 6 weeks. And it's a longer recovery. That is a very important point, is that the growth plates appear and disappear at different times. So a really good example of this is the elbow. There are like 6 growth plates in the elbow. They show up at different times and they close at different times. And so a lot of times we actually have to, like, if we're worried about, is this a fracture or is this just pain? We compare sides. So that's the nice thing about our bodies, is we have most of us, of everything that we can compare. But like in your heel and in your foot, so Severs, for example, that tends to happen on average like 10 to 13-year-olds, because that's when that growth plate gets really irritated. And then kind of moving up the chain, actually up your leg. So I'm going to mostly focus on lower extremity. The growth plates get irritated at like slightly older times. So I usually think about foot happening first, then the knee, usually like our 11 to 14-year-olds. And it's different a little bit with boys than girls too. Girls tend to get it a little bit younger on average, because they tend to go through puberty before boys. Gymnasts sometimes hit puberty a little bit later, depending. So it may just be variable. And then moving up to the hip, those actually can happen more in our high school age kids. So 14 to 18, we'll see those there. So knee, middle school, foot, more elementary school. Yeah. So for hamstring, typically it's mostly things where their hip is flexed, so bent up towards their chest, and then their knee is extended. So think if you're a righty doing a split leap, right? So your right leg. So a lot of things in that position, and usually it's like the quick motion things. So maybe a Stalder, right? Like dropping into that Stalder position may be painful, or a switch leap. But maybe even things just like sprinting. So those really explosive, quick movements. So a lot of gymnastics basically is what's painful.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why it's tougher. And so it's interesting, because actually the literature on proximal hamstring tendinopathy talks about like the two bigger types of classifications we have are either extreme end ranges, right? Which is like the more aesthetic type person who has like really aggressive leg kicking range of motion, or someone who's doing a very rapid kind of elongation to contraction. Like I think, eccentric overload is one term. Some people else call it like the amortization phase. But for those that are not familiar, essentially the elongation is one of the hardest things for a hamstring to do. But then also that rapid contraction, right, causes a lot of shearing forces on the tendon when you're older, but it goes to the growth plate when you're younger. And so you think about what is a switch leap, right? For example, is a switch leap is both of those things. It's a very rapid elongation, but then you have to quickly contract back down to the beam. And so that pulling from end range to down is, I think, why so many people actually get it with switch leaps to start. 'Cause it's like one of the most provocative motions. But like to your point, which is sprinting looks a lot like that too, right? And then snapping into a Stalder looks a lot like that too. And all the other things, round offs, like the hurdle for a round off. And I think that's where it comes up, right? So many repetitive movements have those things.
Yeah. So this is the back of someone's leg. So your hamstrings are made up of 3 muscles. And so going from like the inside to the outside, they're called the semimembranosus, the semitendinosus, and then the biceps femoris. It's not super important, but just know that there's 3 pieces. They start up on, it's called your ischial tuberosity, which is at your pelvis. So that's your sit bones, and then they go all the way down to the back of your knee. So that's an abnormal looking ischial tuberosity there on the right.
I was trying to look at this one over here. I was trying to point for the listeners. There's this side, which is not.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. So on the right,
attached.
sorry. Yes. On our right, the like looker's right, that is a normal looking ischial tuberosity, or what we call, lay people call the sit bones or sits bone. And so, when you're sitting on your butt, you can probably feel those, but that's where the hamstrings start. And what we tend to see is, again, like they may have a little pain up in their hamstrings up kind of high. And then they have that one big pop. They do something explosive or quick, and then they pull, the hamstrings are just so strong that it pulls off that bottom piece of the ischial tuberosity. This is like a really impressive
we found like
one.
the gnarliest one.
Yeah.
I wanted to like make it obvious for someone who's watching, right?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. And so sometimes they won't look this obvious. And like on our x-rays, what we'll see is just, we'll see the little growth plate, and it just looks a little bit wider on one side versus the other, usually the side that hurts. And so that's why, like for medical people who are ordering x-rays, it's really important to get a pelvis and get both sides. Because I just had a kid the other day who had a hip injury, and they just got the one side. And, you know, the radiologist is saying, maybe there's a fracture there. Well, the kid only hurt in the front of the hip. So like that wasn't it. But yeah, that's the pathophysiology, I guess, of it, you know, looking at their exam. And I think it's always important, if you go to a doctor who's not familiar with gymnasts or dancers, they're going to be like, oh, your hamstring flexibility is great. This is excellent. But really comparing side to side and then asking the athlete, like, do you feel like this is not like your stretch that you're feeling, or the tightness or the pain is more than it used to be? I think that's one thing. The second is, are you having pain just walking? So if you have just the apophysitis and you're like, hey, walking's fine, but it's more the gymnastics that hurts, you know, we don't put them on crutches. But if they've had that avulsion fracture and they're having a lot of pain, doing some crutches really just to offload it, because you can't cast that fracture. That would be a little unpleasant. Going to the bathroom might be tricky. So, and then getting them into physical therapy, I think, is really, really key to figure out why did this happen? What are the like mechanics that essentially led to this, and then addressing the issues that are there. So I'm not a physical therapist or an athletic trainer, so like I can't.
Well, I am,
say,
so
like,
I can share.
Exactly. And then say, you know, figuring out, for me, I always want kids to go to the gym some, as long as they feel good going there. But figuring out what skills they can do, right? So you can go and do some like hollow body rocks. You can do push-ups, right? You can do some upper body stuff. Maybe you can even swing bars a little bit, so that you still feel like you're training and staying in shape, but really offloading that hamstring and giving it some time for this. So there's a couple of risk factors we can't control, right? So like I can't control, so the older you are, and if you've had a previous injury, I can't change that, right? Like that's just how you are. But having a previous hamstring injury, or apophysitis in your ischial tuberosity does increase your risk for this. But like you said, the other things of like making sure you have good quad flexibility and hip flexor flexibility is really, really important. And then making sure you have good core and pelvis stability is really important. So like you said, addressing those early on. And then I think the other thing that's really important, especially in our gymnastics world, to note is that what is not a risk factor for this is weight and BMI. So having a higher weight and BMI is not a risk factor for this. So I just always want to emphasize that in our gymnastics.
So after somebody maybe like 8 weeks is tolerating this pretty well, I think it's important that people can realize that you can load the hip and the hamstring, but not do like hamstring curls, right? Which is really not tolerated well. So there's sometimes like compound movements like step ups and split squats, which kind of load the hamstring, but they kind of don't load the hamstring. So something like a regular split squat you're seeing here on screen, or a low box step up, or a single leg squat, those are very knee dominant, quad dominant exercises. And we can get somebody active without causing direct loading to the hamstring. So I would start with, you know, that kind of stuff. I would start with very light soft tissue mobility work. And I would also try to start with just very basic progressions of, I'm trying to kill time so I can get to it. Where is it? Yeah. Very slow progressions of just directly loading, but eventually it is isolated hamstring curls. So it's just doing glute bridges, just doing literally ankle weight hamstring curls, because you just want to get stronger. My recommendation is every other day, so 3 days apart. So load the hamstring, give it 2 days for the growth plate to totally feel okay and monitor symptoms, and then 2 times a week load that. I think that really is the best way to go. I have success with single leg weighted hip lifts, single leg step ups, single leg split squats, and then eventually moving to things that are more directly hamstring loading, like single leg RDLs, or directly doing like a trap bar deadlift. And so I think it's important that people understand there's a lot of progressions we can do from the 8 to 12 week mark, which slowly gets you stronger. And the last thing that I want to see somebody do, probably now looking at like 16 weeks after they've really been tolerating stuff well and they're cleared maybe to do some more, is to try to start doing some like eccentric overload type stuff like this. So like using your hands to take off percentage of your body weight and just doing some split sliders. If somebody can't do this, I can't pause the video without it, but if someone can't do this basic split slider, you know, I'm not even having the conversation about gymnastics and sprinting and running and kicking, because that's all way more dynamic.